everybody sitting comfortably?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. Yeah.
All right, good. Welcome to the Q&A. We're going to talk about something called the hiddenness of God, which is basically this idea that God really ought to show himself more clearly. You know, why isn't he more obvious? Why isn't he making his existence more obvious or evident? And why isn't he responding to people's prayer more obvious and evident than he does? And I want to describe this question by simply telling you a story about a friend of mine who is using an allegory about a father sending letters. So basically, this friend of mine used to be a Christian. He's now, as far as I know, not a Christian. And I've met him personally a few times, but I've mainly had contact with him on the internet and on Facebook and so on. So I sort of saw his struggles, his doubts, his questions. And I remember him writing about how he really couldn't see that God was a father in a relevant way. He said that, you know, God is not a father in any sense of the word that I've experienced fathers. God is rather like a father who is totally absent from his children, and has sent a couple of letters, that is the Bible, for us to read and expect us to have a loving relationship, but you cannot really relate to God as a person. He's too distant, and he's not as obvious as my biological father is. So that was basically him describing this problem or this question. And like the previous arguments or issues we've discussed, this is something that both Christians and non-Christians think about. Many atheists use this as an argument against the existence of God. They say if God really existed, he should have made his existence more obvious because he wants people to believe in him. And many are atheists or non-Christians because they haven't seen enough evidence, they think, that Christianity is true. And so if God is almighty, he has the power to show them that, but he doesn't, and that really suggests that he doesn't exist. And there are various suggestions of how this could take place. For example, some have suggested that perhaps God could place a neon cross, pink, orange, or red, or whatever color, in the sky. So whenever anyone looks up in the sky, they say, oh, there's the cross, and then they know Christianity is true, and then there doesn't have to be any doubt about it. Or perhaps, if you look at a cell in a microscope, you could see a stamp on it which said, made by God. And you could observe that on every cell and come to the conclusion, yeah, that must mean that God exists. Or, this is my favorite, whenever somebody prays and says, dear Lord, then God could have responded, hi, and have a conversation as we human beings have. So whenever I say, God, forgive me my sins, and he just responds in an audible voice that I can hear, your sins are forgiven, then I would have less reason to doubt his existence compared to perhaps how it is now. So this is basically the issue we're going to discuss. And I want to present 5 points of why I don't think that this is a problem to Christianity, and why I don't think that God is hidden. The first point I want to make is to ask the question, what would God achieve by making his existence more obvious? As I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the idea is often that there would be less unbelief if God made his existence more obvious, God wants us to believe in him. The Bible says that he wants everyone to be saved, and thus he should have all the reasons in the world to make himself more obvious. But belief that God exists is actually not the same thing as having a loving relationship to him. It's not the same thing as being saved. The Bible addresses this in the letter of James. Jesus' brother James writes that even the demons believe that God exists, and they tremble because of it. But that is obviously not a saving faith that the Bible talks about elsewhere. Mere knowledge about the existence of God is not the same thing as being saved and having a loving relationship with God. And if that is God's purposes, if that is what he wants to achieve with every human being, which the Bible asserts, then he doesn't have to make himself known or make everybody know that he exists in order to save people. And I want to give some examples of people who may know or be convinced of that God exists, but they still don't want to have anything to do with him. And the first example I discovered quite recently, which is, I think it was after the last week's Q&A, actually. I found a guy on Facebook who was arguing that God is a murderer, God is a thief, and God is an adulterer. And the arguments were pretty bad. For example, his argument for God being an adulterer was that he produced a virgin birth in Mary, and that would suggest that, he cheated with Mary and things like that. And I just assumed that this guy was an atheist, and I started to discuss with him because I tend to like discussions like that. But it turned out that he actually was a believer, and he said that he was angry with God, and he wanted to have a job. He had prayed God for a job, and he hasn't received anything, so he was quite upset. And I suggested that if he wants God to give him a job, perhaps he shouldn't go around and say that God is an adulterer. I compared it with going to your earthly father and saying, "You're a pig, you're monstrous, you're a rapist, give me money." It isn't really, a very good prayer. But that was an example of a person who was convinced that God exists, but that didn't produce the loving relationship that God, according to the Bible, wants to have with us. Another example is a friend of mine back home in Sweden called Simon Ådahl, or Simon. He is very prophetic. He has experienced a lot of miracles. He has prophesied over me and said things that he could not have known by natural means, but God was speaking to him. So it's very powerful what the Holy Spirit is doing in this man. But that hasn't always been the case. He was saved in the 70s in the Jesus movement, which also hit Sweden, just like it came here to the UK. And they experienced miracles already then. So I've interviewed him, and he described quite amazing healings that they experienced. I think he told me about a man who got completely new teeth. So his teeth were completely damaged, and then after that, his teeth were renewed, and the dentist didn't get what had happened, and things like that. So quite astonishing miracles. But then in the 90s, after some personal crisis, Samuel went through a very painful divorce. Then he actually abandoned God, and he couldn't deny that God existed. So he still believed that God exists, but he said, "I don't want anything to do with you." And so he lived like that between 1995 and 2001 until he was brought back to faith. He actually married an atheist called Maria, who awoke in the middle of the night because a man was standing next to her, and she was terrified. But the man said, "I am the Apostle Matthew. Tell your husband that he has to read my book." And she had no idea what an apostle was or about the Gospel of Matthew, because she was an atheist and she had not been attending the religion classes in school. But when she told this to Simon, he was brought back to faith. A third example from the Bible is the soldiers at Jesus' grave. The Roman soldiers who were really the only human witnesses to the resurrection as it happened. The Bible describes it as an angel came down and they were knocked down on the ground, and then Jesus stepped out from the grave. So they would have all the reason to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, since they have seen the resurrection for themselves. But the Bible describes how they actually, for some money, started to spread the lie that Jesus' body was stolen by the disciples, which is a theory that hardly anyone believes. And we're going to talk about the resurrection some few weeks onwards. But those are just some examples of how knowledge about God's existence really isn't the same as being saved. The second point I want to make is that I think that God's existence is obvious. And this is something that the Bible suggests as well. So Paul, in the first chapter of Romans, writes, "Since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." And I would suggest that there are mainly three ways in which we can know that God exists. The first one is arguments from creation, which obviously reveals the Father, and then arguments about the historicity of Jesus, about the Word of God, which is obviously found in the Bible. And then here is a dove. I hope you can see that. Miracles of the Holy Spirit. And we will go through all of these in the coming weeks. If I were to give you all the arguments that I have for the existence of God, we would be here quite a long time. So we're going to discuss this in the future. But to summarize, arguments from creation include, for example, the existence of the universe and the origin of the universe. And our God is the absolutely best explanation for why something exists rather than nothing, and why the universe originated in the first place. We also have arguments from design, both the origin of life as well as the fine-tuning of the universe, which refers to the extreme complexity of the universe and how a minor change in, for example, the constant of gravity or some other constants in physics would make life impossible, not just here on Earth, but in the whole universe, because planets and stars wouldn't be able to form if you monkey with physics a little bit. There are other arguments as well. Then when it comes to the historicity of the Bible, you can point to the abundance of manuscripts of the New Testament, which makes the New Testament a more reliable source than really any historical text from antiquity, due to the amount of manuscripts that we have, and also the temporal closeness to when the events happened or when they were written down when it comes to the New Testament. We also have, of course, Jesus' ministry, Jesus' person, the extreme difficulty in describing who Jesus was and what his ministry was about, while excluding all supernatural activity. Is really, really difficult, because the supernatural element of who Jesus was and the amazing impact that he had on his followers who were ready to die for their faith is quite extraordinary. And of course the resurrection of Jesus. And I actually talked with Hugh about this the other day, at the main alternative theory to what happened to Jesus if God didn't rise him from the dead, is the mass hallucination. Is that the word?
Yeah.
Theory? Yeah. That basically all of the disciples at the same time had the same hallucination of Jesus, and heard him say the exactly same thing as they asked him questions. That is the most popular theory used by non-Christian or skeptic Bible scholars. And again, the idea that it was a conspiracy or that the disciples stole the body is hardly relevant anymore because of the extreme difficulty in understanding why they then would die for their faith, knowing that what they believed in was a lie. Alright, and then we have miracles. I actually have brought a little book with me. This is just volume 1. It's Craig Keener's 1,000 pages long Miracles. And it's quite an amazing read. Quite boring if you're not interested. Quite fascinating if you're interested, like I am. Basically, Craig Keener is a Bible scholar, and he is a bit frustrated in this quite common idea that all supernatural elements should be excluded from history. So when we read the Gospels or Acts or other biblical documents, if there is a miracle and if there's a prophecy, then we should just assume that no, it's not really supernatural, there must be a natural explanation behind it. He questions why scholars do that. And in doing so, he points to the abundance of modern-day miracles and modern-day miracle reports. So this book contains hundreds, if not thousands, of testimonies about miracles. Many of them are actually scientifically verified in that, for example, when a cure has happened, so somebody has been really sick, somebody pray for that person, and then that person who was sick is healthy again. If there is no scientific or medical explanation to that cure, that is dubbed a medically inexplicable event, and there are actually thousands of those. From various traditions, even in the Catholic Church. So you may have heard that Mother Teresa has been canonized and become a saint recently. And in that process, like in every process when it comes to sainthood, the Catholic Church want to confirm that a miracle has happened in connection to the saint, and that has to be medically inexplicable. And that was the case this time as well. So there was a guy in Brazil who was healed from a very severe disease. I don't remember exactly what it was, but he was healed from that. And when doctors say that science cannot explain this, that's when the Catholic Church that a miracle happened here. Also, fascinating people alive today who experience quite a lot of miracles. So this is Heidi Baker, that you may have heard about, a missionary in Mozambique that I met. And in this book she describes how she was saved as a 16-year-old when she was on a what's the word? I don't remember the word, but she was in Mississippi and in a Pentecostal church there. It's this place where the what's the correct word? The Native Americans, they have their own place. Reservation. Thank you. She was on a reservation for a Native American tribe, and she was saved there. Just a couple of weeks after she was saved, she was in the same church, and then she says that she saw a bright white light, and she heard a voice, the voice of God, and she heard it audibly with her ears, saying, "I'm calling you to be a minister and a missionary. You are to go to Africa, Asia, and England," which is, fascinating. And she has been there. She first went to Asia, then to England, took her PhD in theology here, and then she went to Mozambique. And she also describes people being raised from the dead, blind people seeing, deaf people hearing, lame people walking. And you may recall we talked about healing a couple of weeks ago, and I described that most, if not all, people that I know that have been to healing campaigns in Africa or Asia, where the gospel is proclaimed and people pray for healing, they can testify about astonishing miracles. Blind people seeing, deaf people hearing, lame people walking. So it's quite common. And this is something that Craig Keener points to as well, that we have this majority world perspective, as he calls it. Asia, Africa, Latin America, that's the majority of the world's population, and they do experience this. So we cannot just simply ignore that. I've also talked about medically verified healings, and they're not just present in the Catholic Church, of course. There's actually a global network based in South Korea called World Christian Doctors Network, WCDN, and they have a website with a database where they have lots of evidences for medically verified healings when they pray for people and they are well again, and they can assert that with medical evidence. Alright, so due to these three factors and due to miracles that happen are not just person, relative or subjective, but that we can observe impact in people's lives, and we can see that in many cases there are no natural explanation to phenomena that happen after prayer. I think the existence of God is quite obvious, and of course if the existence of God already is obvious, then the idea of the hiddenness of God fails. Then you could argue against all of these, and some people do. That's why I have a lot of debate with atheists on my spare time. And that really showcases something else, I think. Because I don't know, some people may find this not conceiving, the arguments from the origin of the universe, or the argument for the resurrection, or the argument for miracles. But when these arguments are contested, I think that showcases that even if God made his existence even more obvious to what is the case in the actual world, people would argue against that. People would argue that it doesn't really show the existence of God. So this is really our next point, more obvious proofs would be explained away. So let's go back. The neon cross in the sky. When you think about it, it's quite easy to argue against. So even if no scientist would be able to explain why we have this bright shining cross in the sky all the time over the UK or China or everywhere, if you like, people would most likely argue that this is not a proof of Christianity. Rather, they would say that, well, you Christians just have a cross as your symbol because it's a cross in the sky all the time. So they would say that this doesn't show anything. It's not a proof of Christianity. And likewise, even if all the cells had made by God stamped on them, people would most likely argue that that's just a coincidence. That's just, a factor of how nature blindly forms itself, and so these signs which we interpret as letter that form words in the English alphabet is just a coincidence. Similarly to how people sometimes debate whether images that happen in nature, clouds that form that look like Jesus or what have you, some, or I guess all atheists would say that's just a coincidence, that's just, random cloud formation. It doesn't really tell you anything. Likewise, we have a spider that has a cross on its back, the cross spider, and even most Christians would not argue that this is really an evidence for God's existence. So even if God would put that stamp on every cell, there would be question. Now you could say that God responding to each and everyone's prayer would be a quite effective way of him showcasing himself, since that's much harder to infer to just natural processes. But I think it is possible, because the atheists could argue that this is just something that everybody are imagining, because of evolution or what have you, that we think is comfortable to hear the voice of another being, and we think it's God, but really it's just the voice of our parents that we were used to growing up, and so we just place that in our head, and so it's just an illusion. That explanation would be possible. The atheist would be able to claim that, even if God would respond to every prayer in an audible voice directly. And you can go on and on. I think you can really come up with anything that you would want God to do to make his existence more obvious. And it would be possible to come up with counter arguments to that. And I think that really showcases that these arguments are good, even if they are contested, even if people argue against them. I think many of these arguments are extremely good. When I have time, I'm writing on an apologetic book about the argument from miracles, the miraculous argument, and I think that's one of the best arguments for the existence of God. I don't think it really can be refuted, but of course people try to refute it, and quite many people aren't ready to accept the existence of miracles. So that's also one reason why I think it's not really possible to talk about the hiddenness of God, because whatever you would assert that God should do to make his existence more obvious, people would still disbelieve, I think. Alright, and then another important point, God could rightfully only speak privately. So what do I mean by this? I'm not saying that God only speaks privately, because many of the examples I've given are not just private or subjective revelation. You know, the origin of the universe isn't just subjective to me, it's something that's relevant to all of us. And many of the miracles that we can read about in this book, for example, are based on evidence that everybody can check. But even if God would only speak to people personally and reveal his existence personally, and not use any objective means, not do any objective miracle that loads of people can see at the same time, but only speak directly to people. He would have the right to do that, and he would do nothing wrong doing that, because then he would talk to the people and reveal himself to the people that he knows will respond positively to that. Alternatively, which I think there's biblical support of, he could actually speak to and reveal himself to people who are not willing to receive him, and that would give him even greater reason to judge them, so that they receive a treasure which they reject. Whereas in other cases, out of pure mercy for them, he would not reveal himself to them, because he knows that they will reject him and make their case even worse. There's a biblical example of how the Pharisees come to Jesus and they demand a sign from him. They demand a miracle. And Jesus denies them that. He says that the only sign that you will get is the sign of Jonah. And like Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days, so the Son of Man will be under the earth or in the grave for 3 days. So Jesus didn't want to perform a miracle to them. Now, he did perform miracles a lot of times to a large amount of people. So this is not a rule. I'm not suggesting that God is really only doing miracles towards those who are able to receive it. But what I'm saying is that he could do that, and he would do nothing wrong with that. And I definitely think that many people who don't witness miracles, who aren't aware of God's existence, who don't think that there's enough evidence, even if they would get more evidence, it wouldn't follow necessarily that they would actually want to have a loving relationship with him. And then you could say, and I have encountered a lot of people who say that I really wanted to meet God. I really wanted a miracle. I really wanted to see him, to know that he exists. I really prayed for a sign. I was very eager, but nothing happened. And I've encountered people who say that and give that as a reason for not believing, for rejecting faith in God altogether. People who used to be Christians, and then they had doubts or they had problems, and they prayed to God very eagerly and nothing happens. And then obviously the question is, why didn't God respond then? Because in their view, they were honest seekers, and they were really honest and passionate in the longing to see a miracle and to meet God, and nothing happened. So that wouldn't really make sense if God exists, they typically say. But I would suggest that we ought to be careful in making such claims. And obviously this is hard to say when I'm actually dialoguing with a person like that, because typically these are people that I don't know, it's people that I meet when I'm out on the street evangelizing, and so I have no idea about, you know, their life story and the things that they've gone through, or if they're honest talking to me and so on. But as a general principle, I think we should be humble and careful in claiming that we seek 100%. Because the Bible actually says that if we come closer to God, He will come closer to us. In the letter of James, Jesus said himself that knock and the door shall be open. So there is this promise that we will encounter God. We will know that He exists and that He loves us as we eagerly seek Him. The reason that I'm saying that we should be careful in claiming that we to 100% completely and fully have sought Him is again due to our meeting with the majority world. I have some friends who went to Kenya on a revival meeting there, and again, you know, blind people saw, deaf people heard, lame people walking. These people, older couple in Sweden, they were actually right behind where they played when they prayed for crippled people. And so this man that I talked to, he held the hands of a girl who for the first time in her life could stand up on her feet and could walk, and he said it was the most powerful thing in his life. Now, what really touched me was not just the miracles that they described, but the preparations for this revival event. They say that the people who were responsible for it fasted, I think it was 6 days without food and water. So it was really, really tough, right? Maybe they had water, right? I'm not so sure about that, but definitely no food. And they were praying constantly as they did that. People came to this revival meeting hours and hours before the meeting actually began. We talked about African time previously, and sometimes our Africans have a tendency to show up very late. Well, sometimes they show up very early, and of course it's due to the priority of the event. Whenever, you know, I've been in South Africa myself, and the zeal and the passion that is there is extraordinary. I listened today to an interview with Os Guinness, and he described the church in China and said that they have a passion that is out of this world, that makes me ashamed of myself as a Christian. And, you know, as these people exist, that I think we can surely say give 100% to God. In the Western world, we should be more humble. I think especially that the wealth that we have here and the privileges binds us, and we have to live even more simply than we do in the Jesus Army, I think, in order to come into this dependency that God expects from us. We'll really give it all. And again, it's hard to speak about this because we all have our, you know, personal history, and we really think that we have given 100%. But even when I look back at my own life, and I can only speak for myself, even though I know that there were periods of time when I gave more to God, when I was seeking Him even more, I would not claim that I still gave 100%. You know, I've encountered people who have experienced torture and massive persecution due to their faith, and they still stand strong for Jesus. And so that's why I have this final point that before we make the statement that I was seeking for God 100% and He was still hidden, we should be a bit more humble, and I think continue to listen to the stories of people who we ourselves can admit probably have been seeking for Him even more than us. And I think that their testimony very often is that God actually provides and that God actually answers. Those are my 5 points. Now let's go to the questions part.